British rail enthusiasts have always been excited by the latest developments. The greatest of these has been the diesel locomotive. Dr. Rudolf Diesel is usually credited with the invention which bears his name. It was actually a Yorkshireman, Herbert Ackroyd Stewart, who patented the first oil engine based on compression ignition in the late 19th century. This was one of the first diesel locomotives built during the Great War. By the 1930s, experimental diesels were appearing all over Britain. John Alcock was the first diesel locomotive to be operated by a British mainline railway. The LMS, desperate to cut the costs of its shunting operations, eventually bought number 7401 along with 3 other Hunslet prototypes. The roomy cab was convenient for instructing drivers in the art of handling this new type of engine. In 1952, British Rail began to realize the benefits of the small diesel shunter. BR ordered large quantities from private contractors while developing their own workshop capacity. The Drury shunter was one of the first diesel types to be mass-produced for British Railways. British Rail's diesel mechanical shunters were all fitted with Gardner engines, mostly rated at 204 horsepower. But the mechanical transmission made them unpopular with crews. In poor condition, the time spent in gear changing could result in total loss of acceleration. This 153 horsepower Barclay 040 was the smallest of the shunters. The tiny frame was essential for the tight curves in London's docklands. Although unforeseen at the time, there was massive overproduction of these small diesel shunters. Beeching's closure of lines and yards and a move to container and bulk traffic meant that many of them only had short lives. The Class 06 lasted longer than most, the last being withdrawn in 1980. Only one example was preserved in Britain. Electrical transmission eventually won the day. The first of the type was introduced by the LMS in 1945. British Rail based their standard 350 horsepower diesel-electric shunter on the pre-nationalization LMS Class 11. Between 1952 and 1962, a record number of 1,193 of the 08 shunter and its 09 and 10 variations were built. It has undoubtedly been British Rail's most successful design and will remain part of the modern rail system well into the next century. With the BR fleet reduction in the early 1970s, many engines were acquired by private industry. They have since served lengthy second careers. Vulcan is one of the two British prototype shunters built in 1956 to compare the performance of either electrical or hydraulic transmission. The electric version clearly proved its superiority, and the hydraulic twin sister was scrapped. The Class 07 was unusual in being a standard industrial type, purchased off the shelf from the maker. All 14 were allocated to Southampton docks to replace retiring USA steam tanks. Hydraulic transmission appeared in 1947 in a Drury 060 shunter. This was the forerunner of the later British Rail Class 02 dock shunter. These 20 short wheel-based engines were the Yorkshire Engine Company's only production order from British Rail. In 1955, the British Rail Modernization Plan announced the replacement of all steam locomotives. Under a new pilot scheme, diesel manufacturers could build prototypes for British Rail with the possibility of further orders for the most successful design. The Class 31, designated as the Brush Type 2, was based on a design supplied to Ceylon in 1953. Its success is demonstrated by the fact that the class is still in mainline use today. The 20 pilot locomotives were followed by almost 250 more. But an expensive re-engineering program later saw all the original Merlys motors replaced with English electric diesels. The Metropolitan Vickers Co-Bow did not fare so well. The desire for high starting tractive effort resulted in this unique 5-axle machine. The Crosley 2-stroke engine proved unreliable, and all 20 Co-Bows were withdrawn within 10 years. The first diesel-electric mainline express locos were introduced by the LMS in 1947. English Electric's Type 3 Cocos employed a V-form 16-cylinder power unit, the forerunner of all English electric engines. Initially, 20 English Electric Type 1 Bobos, later Class 20, were built. They were the first pilot scheme locomotives to be delivered, with D8000 handed over in June 1957. For working slow pickup goods and station pilot duties, they were very reliable. But the single cab gave poor visibility, especially when travelling bonnet first. Based on a similar model exported to Portugal, the initial allocation was to the first all-diesel depot at Devons Road. Engines were fitted with multiple unit control and were often found in pairs. Most of the survivors now work coal or steel trains in the Midlands. Ten English Electric Type 4s were ordered in November 1955. These powerful diesel locos operated the East Coast Main Line, but were soon displaced by the Deltics. Despite being labelled as ponderous, Class 40 has always been loved by enthusiasts. 7 have been preserved, representing all the different external designs. The English Electric Type 3 was derived from the pilot scheme Class 40, but had a far better power-to-weight ratio. Drivers refer to them as noisy and uncomfortable, but nevertheless the most reliable engines on British rail. From the outset, the Class 37s were an immediate success. More than 300 were built. They're extremely reliable and able to handle almost any type of train. They've come to be regarded as a true mixed traffic locomotive, equally capable of grinding away with enormous loads of freight or thrashing up the main line, hauling an expressway. With her distinctive sound and rather dated nose, the 37 is typically English Electric, but she should be still running into the next century. The successful trials of the prototype Deltic generated an order for 22 more for the East Coast Main Line. They took over the prestigious King's Cross to Scotland routes, which in steam days had been the province of the A4 Pacifics. Following a brief turn from the Class 40, the Deltics replaced 55 express steam locomotives on these routes. Names were shared between Derby winners and British regiments. In 1982, when they finally went out of service, there was heavy demand from diesel enthusiasts for them. About a third of the class has been preserved. The class takes its name from the unique delta-shaped engine, which is able to produce 3,300 horsepower. They were the most powerful passenger locomotives on British rail. The 50 locomotives in this class were not purchased, but leased from English Electric in order to spread the cost. The last delivery in 1968 completed the first phase of British Rail's diesel program. The class initially replaced the Jubilees on West Coast workings to Scotland. They were later transferred to the Western region, as the Westerns were withdrawn pending the arrival of the new high-speed trains. As the last of the 50s were withdrawn in 1994, there was frantic activity to preserve as many of them as possible. The charisma of the 50s has made them very popular with enthusiasts. No less than 17 have been preserved. Great Gable, like the rest of her class, was named after mountain peaks. All were initially allocated to crew, where they were employed on fast passenger and parcels trains. These pilot scheme diesels had a 1 co-co-1 wheel arrangement. It was forced upon them to spread the load, but they suffered from chronic weight and high axle load disadvantages. There was simply not enough power to counterbalance their enormous bulk. Despite the design faults, the peak classes bore the brunt of long-distance mainline work until they were replaced by Class 47. The Class 45 was also a peak, but of slightly modified design, with an improved Sulzer engine. The Class 46 was fitted with brush electrical equipment. In 1994, D172 Ixion became the first preserved diesel to be passed for mainline running on British Rail. Here at Ramsbottom, the proud owner, Pete Waterman, takes the controls. Ten years earlier, Another Class 46 achieved fame when it was deliberately destroyed in order to test the integrity of a nuclear flask. Derby's first Type 2 design was another pilot scheme locomotive. The original aim of gentle introduction had been abandoned, and 151 of these diesels were built for the London Midland region. They operated mixed traffic between London and Crewe. Small and punchy, with an ability to handle a wide variety of duties, they seem to be the natural successors to a long line of Midland and LMS medium-powered locomotives. The class incorporated the successful Sulzer 6 LDA power unit with 137BY traction motors and BTH transmission. Some of the mistakes made in the Class 24 design were rectified in the 25. The main difference was an increased power output through the use of intercooling. The 327 members of Class 25 easily replaced twice their number of steam locomotives. With the demise of the Class 17 and 29, the 25s became more prominent in Scotland. In South Wales and the West Country, they completely ousted the Class 22. Prior to withdrawal in the 1980s, the class were found all over Britain. Another development of the Type 2 was the Class 27. They were intended for use in Scotland and started their life on the West Highland Line. They were similar in design to the earlier Class 33, also built by the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. Those earmarked for the Scottish region were fitted with tablet catching apparatus for single-line working. From 1962, they took over the Edinburgh-Carlisle passenger trains and worked in tandem on freight rosters over the same route. The Sulzer Type 3 also proved to be an extremely reliable locomotive, and slim versions were designed for the restricted loading gauge of the Hastings line. The first 3 brush Type 4s appeared in late 1962 and were allocated to the eastern region. They soon proved their use on a wide variety of services, from freight and engineering to push-pull and express passenger trains. Over a 5-year period, more than 500 of these powerful locomotives were built, making them the most numerous mainline diesel class in British Rail. They became the mainstay of British Rail's mainline motive power. The first of the mainline diesel hydraulics, the warships, were based on the successful German Federal Railway's V200 class. They were cut down in height and width to fit the British loading gauge. The warships ended their working life in 1972, but withdrawal triggered the start of the diesel preservation movement. The Hymek was intended to replace steam locomotives in the west of England, working passenger, freight and parcel trains between London and the West and South Wales. The last were withdrawn in 1975. Fitted with a Maybach engine, the transmission is by McHydro. The first Western entered service in 1961. They hauled West of England expresses, and their liveries of maroon, desert sand, Brunswick green and blue proved extremely popular with the enthusiast. the 74 Westerns had a comparatively short life. But upon withdrawal, enthusiasm for their preservation exceeded even the warships. Built at Swindon and Crewe, the Western is fitted with 2 Maybach engines. Based on an earlier Yorkshire Engine Company prototype, the Class 14 is a heavy shunting, transfer and trip-working engine with a central driving cab, and she's powered by a Paxman engine. This class was allocated to the Western region. The work it was designed for was eliminated as Class 14 was introduced. These engines were withdrawn in 1969, and a large number entered industrial service with the NCB and British Steel. The first electro-diesels emerged from Eastleigh Works in February 1962. The locomotives were designed to operate from a third-rail electrical supply, as well as being able to run independently, powered by their own diesel generator. Almost all the class run in the southeast, where duties include the prestigious Orient Express as well as the Gatwick Express. In 1973, during its first trials, the prototype HST power car broke the British speed record set by the famous steam engine Mallard. A few days later, the world record was also broken with a speed of 143 miles per hour. Production units finally entered service on the Western region in 1976. Powered by the famous Paxman Valenta engine, the trains were known as the InterCity 125. They ushered in a new era of passenger comfort and journey times. For non-electrified lines, they are now the mainstay of the InterCity network. Dieselization was completed in 1968, and no new locomotives were planned beyond that date. But the oil crisis led to fears that there would be a large increase in coal traffic. A new design could not be produced in time, so an interim measure was to base the design of the new Class 56 on the existing Class 47. First Class 56 diesel electrics were assembled at the Craiova works in Romania, but the majority of the 135 locomotives came from British Rail Engineering in Doncaster. The English Electric Power Unit was a direct descendant of the prototype mainline diesels of 1947, but now developed twice the power. The Class 58 was a cheaper and more economic alternative to the 56. These powerful 3,300 brake horsepower freight locomotives were designed chiefly for merry-go-round workings, and they entered traffic in 1983. The Class 60 replaced the older Class 20, which often had to work in tandem. Its route availability is fairly limited, but it is British Rail's most powerful locomotive. The class is 100 strong, and many have acquired the name that once belonged to the peaks. The four-wheel diesel rail bus was never regarded as a success on British Rail because it generated bus-style revenue with rail-style overheads, and line closures in the 1960s finally starved it of work. 3 of the 5 vehicles from West Germany were re-equipped with standard AEC engines. But, like the rail buses from AC cars, all were withdrawn within 10 years. As the early diesel multiple units have deteriorated, there have been attempts to spruce up their image by referring to them as heritage units. They are gradually being phased out, but certain units, such as the 101, still operate on provincial lines all over the country. 600 of these units were built, and they were once very common indeed. From 1956, several different classes of diesel multiple unit were built at British Rail's Derby works. Most were powered by 2 BUT 6-cylinder horizontal engines and fitted with a standard mechanical transmission and 4-speed gearbox. Although the Derby units have now all been withdrawn, a number have survived in preservation. The preservation of DMUs may not be as glamorous as steam, but the movement is growing, and it's now unlikely that any class still operating today will be completely lost. A prototype for a new generation of multiple units was evaluated in the early 80s and gave rise to the railbus or pacer. These two-car units were built from bus parts with a Leyland engine and Voigt hydraulic transmission. The Class 143 was similar in design, but with bodies built by Alexander, with Barclay underframes. The biggest class of DMU is now the BREL Express. This provincial diesel is powered by a Cummins engine, has a maximum speed of 90 miles per hour, and can be found all over the network. The 90s have seen further developments with Network Southeast's turbo units. These have a Perkins engine and a Voigt hydraulic transmission. The name Turbo Express gives the impression that the 166 is faster. It isn't, but it does have the added luxury of air conditioning. Beyond British Rail, there are hundreds of small independent rail systems where a wide range of industrial locomotives operate. Many sites introduced diesel shunters before the war, and even the coal board, with its own supply of fuel for steam engines, soon moved over to the new form of motive power. Ruston and Hornsby was one of the most prolific manufacturers, and around 300 of their locomotives have since found their way into preservation. For its quarry shunting operations at Whately, Amalgamated Roadstone employs 3 diesel hydraulic locomotives, all built by Thomas Hill of Rotherham. Steam has long since disappeared from industrial sites, but here on the Strathspey Bay Railway, a diesel coaling crane can still find work. Diesel and steam working together in harmony. Many British rail locomotives have gone on to second careers in private hands. But the Hunslet-Barclay Class 20s are a little different. Although privately owned, they are used for weed-killing duties and visit more of the British rail system than any other locomotives. Blue John was built by Hunslet-Barclay. It's used to transfer cement wagons from Blue Circle's Hope works. The Class 59 is Britain's most powerful locomotive with a turbocharged diesel engine rated at 3,300 horsepower. Built in North America by General Motors, they are the only British Rail designated class to be entirely in private ownership. They're owned by Foster Yeoman and Amalgamated Roadster. In 1994, National Power acquired one as well. Simplex locomotives are extremely basic, but the early design was incredibly successful. Simplex and its successor, Motor Rail, continued producing variations on this design for over 70 years. These popular 20 to 28 brake horsepower locomotives both date from the Second World War. They're powered by a transversely mounted water-cooled Dorman engine with a 2-speed reversing gearbox and chain drive. Until the 1960s, narrow-gauge mineral and quarry lines such as the Festiniog were fairly common. As they were self-contained, there was no need to conform to any other railway system, and the smaller gauge had the advantage of low initial cost and greater flexibility. Designed for industrial work, these small engines have adapted well to life on a preserved railway. The most recent castle has known nothing else, having been built especially for the Festiniog. The Romney Hythe and Dymchurch is only 15-inch gauge and prides itself on being the world's smallest main line. In the 1980s, the railway was contracted to take children to school, and 2 modern diesels were designed and built by TMA in Birmingham. These are the most powerful 15-inch gauge diesels in the world. We finish on Snowdon, with Britain's highest railway. In 1986, this rack railway's aging steam locomotives were supplemented by 2 Hunslet 040 diesel hydraulics. The drive is through the rack gear, while the carrying wheels are free to rotate on their axles. These locomotives proved so successful that the railway later ordered another 2.